I always thought my brother was my protector, my anchor, but one night changed everything. It was just an ordinary evening until I caught the look in his eyes, a mix of longing and confusion that sent shivers down my spine. In that moment, everything I believed about us shattered, leaving me questioning what boundaries we had crossed and whether we could ever go back to being just family. I grew up in a modest but warm home where love was woven into the small, everyday rituals: dinners at 6 sharp, the soft hum of an old radio in the background, and the faint scent of lavender from my mother's carefully tucked linens. But the heart of that home wasn't the creaky floorboards or the flickering porch light. It was my older brother, Ben. Ben was 5 years older than me, and from as far back as I could remember, he was my rock, steady, dependable, and always present. He had a quiet intensity about him, the kind that commanded respect without ever demanding it. I adored him, not in the fleeting, idolizing way siblings sometimes do, but with a deep, unshakable trust. He was my protector and my partner in navigating the uncertainties of life. Our bond deepened during my teenage years when our parents left to work abroad. Their absence left an emotional void that Ben and I filled by building a world of our own. He took on the role of caretaker naturally, though not without struggle. I remember the first time he tried recreating Mom's lasagna. The noodles were too firm, the sauce watery, but we laughed through every bite. It became our ritual to cook together, a way to keep our parents close, even from afar. Weekends were for hikes in the nearby hills. Those afternoons were my favorite, just Ben and me, walking through the stillness of nature. He'd stop to point out a bird's feather or the name of a tree, his voice calm and full of reverence. It was in those moments that I realized how much I admired him, not just as a brother, but as a person. He made me feel safe in a world that often felt uncertain. At night, we'd sit on the worn couch in the living room, the TV glowing faintly in the background, talking about life. He listened to my teenage woes without judgment, making me feel like my thoughts mattered. We built a life of quiet comfort, but beneath it was a shared understanding of the loneliness that came with our parents' absence. Ben was my world, and I was his joy, a bond we thought was unbreakable. Until everything changed. As I grew older, life began to shift. College was the first major change, taking me away from the small, safe world Ben and I had built together. It was exciting, new people, new experiences, and a freedom I had only dreamed of. But as much as I tried to embrace my independence, I couldn't help but feel the pull of home. Ben and I stayed in touch, our phone calls filled with updates about my classes and stories about his work, but something was changing between us. At first, it was subtle. His questions about my new life were laced with an unfamiliar caution. "You've been going out a lot, haven't you?" he asked one evening. His voice was steady, but I could sense the unease beneath it. I brushed it off, assuring him it was just study groups and campus events. But I knew he wasn't convinced. When I returned home during breaks, the tension was undeniable. Ben had always been protective, but now his concern felt heavier, almost invasive. He would ask who I was spending time with, what I was doing, and why I seemed different. "You're growing up," he said one night, his tone unreadable. "But I feel like I'm losing you." I noticed changes in him, too. He had always been calm and composed, but now there was a restlessness about him. His gaze lingered too long, his questions probing deeper than before. It wasn't just worry, it was something more, something unspoken. I found myself avoiding his eyes, unsure of what I might see there. The cracks in our relationship grew wider when I started spending more time with friends. One evening, after a late night out, I returned home to find Ben waiting in the dimly lit living room. His expression was a mix of worry and something I couldn't quite place. "It's almost 2 a.m., he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that felt disproportionate to the situation. "It's not a big deal," I replied, trying to brush past him. But he stopped me, his eyes searching mine. "It's not about the time," he said. "It's about you. You're different, Emma. Distracted. Distant. I don't know where I fit in your life anymore." His words stung, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. He was right, I had changed. I was discovering who I was outside of our small world, but I hadn't realized how much it was affecting him. Or maybe I had, and I didn't want to face it. The unspoken tension between us became a constant presence. Every conversation felt weighted, every silence stretched longer than it should. I started to notice the way he watched me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't define. Concern, sadness, longing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. The turning point came one evening when I returned home from another night out. Ben was waiting for me again, his expression unreadable. Is this going to be a regular thing now? He asked, his tone even but heavy. You're shutting me out, Emma. I'm not shutting you out, I snapped, my frustration bubbling over. I'm just living my life. He didn't respond immediately, but the look in his eyes said everything. I had always seen Ben as my protector, my constant, but now there was something else in his gaze. Something that made my heart race and my thoughts spiral. It was the moment I realized we had crossed into unfamiliar territory, and there was no going back. The tension between us had become impossible to ignore. Every interaction seemed charged, every glance lingering just a moment too long. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew that something between us had shifted, something that neither of us was ready to confront. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I felt Ben's presence before I saw him. He leaned against the doorway, his expression unreadable. Do you need help? He asked, his voice softer than usual. I shook my head, trying to ignore the way my heart raced whenever he was near. Emma, he said quietly, stepping closer. I turned to face him, the air between us thick with unspoken words. His gaze held mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. I'm sorry, he murmured, pulling his hand back. But he didn't step away. Instead, he stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I didn't know what to say, so I turned back to the sink, pretending to focus on the dishes. My mind raced, every nerve in my body acutely aware of his presence. Over the next few days, the distance between us seemed to collapse. Little moments became loaded with meaning. A glance across the room, a hand brushing mine as we passed each other, the way his voice softened when he said my name. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but the way he looked at me told a different story. One night, as I sat on the couch reading, Ben walked into the room and hesitated before sitting beside me. The space between us felt electric, every inch charged with the weight of what we weren't saying. Emma, he said, his voice low. I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine. The kiss was brief, hesitant, but it was enough to send my world spinning. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, filled with a mix of fear and longing. I shouldn't have done that, he whispered, his voice shaking. But the truth was, I didn't want him to apologize. In that moment, I felt something I couldn't explain, something that scared me and thrilled me all at once. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. Don't. After that night, everything between us changed. We danced around each other, neither of us willing to acknowledge what had happened but unable to forget it. Every touch, every glance felt heavier, as if the air between us had grown thicker. The tension was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. One afternoon, as we hiked through the hills near our home, the stillness of nature seemed to mirror the silence between us. Do you remember when we used to come here all the time? I asked, my voice breaking the quiet. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You always made us take the long trail, even when it started raining. I laughed softly, the memory warming me. I just didn't want the day to end. Neither did I, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I turned to him, and the look in his eyes stopped me in my tracks. It was the same look he'd given me in the kitchen, the same unspoken longing that had been building between us. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. Instead, he laced his fingers with mine, his grip firm and steady. We stood there, the world around us fading into the background, as the weight of our connection settled over us. That night, as we sat on the porch under the stars, Ben finally broke the silence. Emma, whatever this is, it's not right. I know, I whispered, my voice trembling. But I don't know how to stop it. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. Neither do I. We sat there in silence, the unspoken truth hanging between us. Neither of us knew where this would lead, but we both knew there was no turning back. The boundaries that had once defined our relationship had blurred, and the line we had crossed could never be uncrossed. The tension between Ben and me reached a boiling point one fateful evening. We had been avoiding the truth for weeks, tiptoeing around the feelings that simmered just beneath the surface. But secrets like ours have a way of demanding attention, no matter how hard you try to bury them. It started as a quiet evening. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, a mundane task that should have felt ordinary. But nothing about our lives felt ordinary anymore. Ben walked in, his presence filling the room. Need any help? He asked, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it I couldn't ignore. I shook my head, focusing on chopping vegetables. No, I've got it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and searching. Finally, he broke the quiet. Emma, we need to talk. I froze, the knife hovering over the cutting board. About what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. About us, he said, his voice steady but strained. We can't keep pretending nothing's happening. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. What do you want me to say, Ben? That I'm confused? That I don't know what this is or how it happened? His expression softened, a flicker of pain crossing his face. I'm not blaming you, Emma. I'm just as lost as you are. The vulnerability in his voice broke something in me. Tears welled up in my eyes and I shook my head. We were fine, Ben. We had a good thing, a safe, simple life. Why did it have to change? He stepped closer, his movements careful, deliberate. Because things like this don't stay hidden forever. We've been lying to ourselves, Emma. This isn't just going to go away. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. The feelings that had grown between us weren't something we could ignore anymore. They were consuming us, pulling us into a place we didn't know how to navigate. Before I could respond, there was a sudden knock at the front door. The sound jolted us both, cutting through the charged atmosphere like a knife. I wiped at my face, trying to compose myself, as Ben went to answer it. When he opened the door, my best friend, Rachel, stood there, her cheerful expression faltering as she looked between us. Hey, she said, her voice hesitant. Am I interrupting something? No, Ben said quickly, stepping back to let her in. Not at all. But Rachel's eyes lingered on me, her brow furrowing. You okay, Emma? You look upset. I forced a smile, shaking my head. I'm fine. Just a long day. She didn't seem convinced, but she let it go, launching into a story about something that had happened at work. I nodded along, trying to focus, but my mind was elsewhere. I could feel Ben's presence across the room, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on me. After Rachel left, the silence between us returned, heavier than before. She knows something's wrong, I said quietly, not meeting his gaze. She doesn't know anything, Ben replied, his voice firm. And she won't. This stays between us, Emma. But I wasn't so sure. Rachel was perceptive, and if she picked up on the tension between us, it was only a matter of time before someone else did. The thought sent a chill down my spine. What if someone finds out, Ben? What if? He stepped closer, cutting me off. No one will find out, he said, his voice low. Because we won't let them. His words were meant to reassure me, but they only heightened my anxiety. The weight of our secret was becoming too much to bear, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it hidden. The breaking point came a few days later. I was sitting in my room, staring at a photo of Ben and me from years ago. We looked so happy, so carefree. It felt like a lifetime ago. The person in that photo wasn't the same person sitting here now, tangled in feelings she didn't understand. Ben knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. Emma, he said, his voice hesitant. We can't keep going on like this. I looked up at him, my heart aching at the sadness in his eyes. I don't know what to do, Ben. I don't know how to fix this. He sat down beside me, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. Maybe we can't fix it, he said quietly. Maybe we just have to figure out how to live with it. His words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. I wanted to believe we could find a way forward, but the path ahead felt impossibly uncertain. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between us reached a fever pitch. Every interaction felt like walking a tightrope, every glance charged with the weight of what we couldn't say. The boundaries we had once taken for granted were gone, replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. And then it happened, the moment that shattered everything. It was a quiet evening, the kind that should have felt normal but didn't. I was sitting on the couch, reading, when Ben walked in. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his expression conflicted. Ben, I asked, setting the book aside. What's wrong? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room and sat down beside me, his movements slow and deliberate. Emma, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep pretending. I can't keep lying to myself. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was anything but hesitant. It was raw, desperate, filled with everything we had been holding back. When he pulled away, his eyes searched mine, as if looking for some kind of reassurance. I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling. I know this isn't right, but I can't stop. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, guilt, longing. Ben, I whispered, my voice breaking. I don't know what we're doing. Neither do I, he admitted. But I know I can't lose you. The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in around us. I didn't know where we would go from here, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following that night felt like walking through a storm, each moment heavy with the weight of what we had done. Ben and I avoided each other as much as possible, our once comfortable routine now shattered. When we did cross paths, our interactions were polite but hollow, as though we were both trying to convince ourselves that everything was normal. But it wasn't. Nothing was normal anymore. I found myself replaying that night over and over in my mind, dissecting every word, every touch, every glance. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the undeniable pull I still felt toward him. It was as if we were caught in an endless cycle, each of us too afraid to confront the reality of what had happened. Ben wasn't faring any better. The shadows under his eyes grew darker, and his once steady demeanor became strained. I'd catch him staring at me sometimes, his expression a mix of regret and longing, but he never said anything. Neither of us did. We were trapped in a fragile silence, each too scared to speak for fear of what might come out. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. I was in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, when Ben walked in. He hesitated at the doorway, his hand gripping the frame as if he was bracing himself. "Emma," he said, his voice low. "We can't keep pretending this didn't happen." I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "I know," I whispered. "But I don't know what to do, Ben. I don't know how to make this right." He sat down across from me, his elbows resting on his knees. "Maybe we can't make it right," he said. "Maybe we just have to face it." "Face what?" I asked, my voice rising. "That we've ruined everything? That we've crossed a line we can't come back from?" His jaw tightened and he looked away. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know we can't keep avoiding it. It's tearing us apart." His words hit me like a punch to the gut because they were true. The bond we had spent years building was unraveling, and neither of us knew how to stop it. The following weeks were a blur of tension and avoidance. Ben and I barely spoke, each of us retreating further into our own worlds. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and suffocating. Even the smallest things, dinner, a shared glance, became unbearable reminders of what we had lost. And yet, despite the pain, there was still a part of me that clung to him. I missed the way things used to be, the easy banter and quiet understanding we once shared. But I also knew that those days were gone, replaced by a new reality neither of us could fully accept. The breaking point came one quiet afternoon. I was sitting on the porch, staring out at the yard, when Ben joined me. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside me, his presence both comforting and unsettling. After a long silence, he spoke. "Emma, I've been thinking. Maybe I need to leave for a while." His words sent a jolt through me, and I turned to him, my heart sinking. "Leave? What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, his expression pained. "I think we need space. Time to figure out who we are, apart from all of this." Panic welled up inside me. The thought of him leaving, of being alone in the house without him, was almost too much to bear. "You can't just leave, Ben. We need to figure this out together." "I don't think we can," he said quietly. "Not like this. Maybe some distance will help us see things more clearly." Tears blurred my vision, and I shook my head. "You're my brother, Ben. I don't know how to do this without you." "You're stronger than you think, Emma," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I'll always be here for you. But right now, I think this is the only way." The finality in his tone broke something in me, and I realized that there was no changing his mind. As much as it hurt, I knew he was right. The only way to heal was to step back, to try and rebuild our lives separately. The day Ben left was one of the hardest of my life. We stood in the doorway, neither of us saying much. He hugged me tightly, and for a moment, it felt like everything would be okay. But as he walked out the door, the reality of his absence hit me like a wave. The house felt emptier than ever, and the weight of our shared secret loomed heavy over me. I didn't know what the future held, or if we would ever find our way back to each other. But I knew one thing. The life we had once shared was gone, replaced by a new, uncertain reality. In the weeks that followed, I tried to piece my life back together. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything threatened to crush me. But I pushed forward, determined to find some semblance of normalcy. As for Ben, I didn't hear from him for a while. But I knew deep down that he was struggling just as much as I was. And though we were apart, the bond we shared, complicated, messy, and irrevocable, would always tie us together. The weeks after Ben's departure were some of the loneliest of my life. The house that had once been our sanctuary now felt like a hollow shell, every corner echoing with memories of what we had shared. I would find myself walking into the kitchen and instinctively looking toward the door, expecting him to walk in with that familiar, steady presence. But he never did. In his absence, I was forced to confront the gravity of everything that had happened. The emotions I had buried came rushing to the surface: guilt, regret, and an overwhelming sadness for what we had lost. I spent hours reflecting on the choices we had made and the consequences they had unleashed. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it all. At first, it was unbearable. The silence, the emptiness, the knowledge that the one person who had always been my anchor was no longer there to steady me. But slowly, I began to find strength in the solitude. I started focusing on myself, on rediscovering who I was outside of my relationship with Ben. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I had once loved but had set aside. I began to rebuild a sense of self that wasn't tied to him. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm me, when I wanted nothing more than to pick up the phone and hear his voice. But I knew that reaching out would only reopen wounds that were still raw. We needed this time apart, no matter how much it hurt. In the quiet of those weeks, I found clarity. I realized that what had happened between Ben and me wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of something deeper. We had leaned on each other for so long, filling the void left by our parents' absence, that we had blurred the lines between who we were as individuals and who we were to each other. Our love had become a lifeline, but it had also become something we didn't know how to define. I began to understand that healing didn't mean erasing what had happened. It meant acknowledging it, learning from it, and finding a way to move forward. For me, that meant forgiving myself and Ben. It meant letting go of the guilt and accepting that we were both human, both flawed, and both struggling to navigate an impossible situation. Months passed before I heard from Ben again. When his message finally came, it was simple but heartfelt. "I hope you're doing okay. I miss you." I stared at those words for a long time, unsure how to respond. I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out my heart, and let him know how much I missed him, too. But I also knew that some things couldn't be fixed with a single conversation. Instead, I replied, "I'm doing better. I hope you are, too." It wasn't much, but it was honest. It was a start. Over time, we began to rebuild our relationship, carefully and cautiously. The bond we shared was still there, but it was different now, wiser, more measured. We both knew that we could never go back to the way things were, but we could try to create something new, something healthier. Looking back, I realized that the greatest lesson I learned from that time was the importance of boundaries, of knowing where you end and someone else begins. Ben and I had been so intertwined that we had lost sight of ourselves as individuals. It wasn't until we stepped back and gave each other space that we were able to truly grow. In the end, our story wasn't about forbidden feelings or crossed boundaries. It was about resilience. About two people who loved each other deeply but had to learn how to let go and stand on their own. And though the road was painful, it led us to a place of understanding, of forgiveness, and of hope. If I could offer one piece of advice to anyone navigating the complexities of love and relationships, it would be this: never lose sight of who you are. Love can be a beautiful, transformative force, but it should never come at the expense of your own identity. If you were in their shoes, what would you have done? Could you rebuild after crossing such impossible boundaries? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of love, trust, and betrayal. Stay tuned for our next shocking tale. You won't believe what's coming next.